This is Word on the Streets, a podcast about the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project. This podcast is created by the City of Midland, Michigan, and produced by the MCTV Network. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 5 of Word on the Streets, a podcast about information, updates, and perspective on the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project in Midland, Michigan, and beyond. I'm your host, Katie Geyer. As our listeners may remember, MDOT held a public input open house at City Hall on Wednesday, July 20th to share preliminary project designs, construction timeline, and more information on the Buttles Street redesign. So today, I'm excited to have John Kelley, the Projects and Contracts Engineer for the Michigan Department of Transportation out of the Mount Pleasant Transportation Service Center, here to talk with us today about that meeting, talk what happened, and share what's coming up next on this project. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Katie. I'm glad most times when I talk about my work, people are bored and want to walk away. So I'm excited to have someone interested in it.
Well, we will always be interested here, at least when it comes to this kind of stuff. So before we get started, tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you came to work on this project.
Well, majority of my career, about 15 years, I was in the private sector or in the consultant sector working on public projects. But and then as of last November, I joined on the Michigan Department of Transportation, my current role, in which I became project manager in this project. And I guess a disclaimer now, it's as well as about 20 other projects. So still digging into some of the details on this project. But as a City of Midland resident, I've been well in the loop on the history of this and the studies, the open houses, the actual physical reduction with the cones, and I would attend a lot of those as a interested citizen, actually, which
Sure.
from my perspective is very fun to do because I can show up and not half the room automatically hates me, right off the bat. So I was well in the loop. Going through all that, and now it's exciting to actually be the one managing the project from MDOT's side of things.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it's cool to have someone that has some history, both as a resident and also now working on this project as a part of it. So for those of you who are joining us or anyone else who'd like to see these designs in greater detail, if you're listening on audio, as we talk through these designs, you can head over to the podcast website, which is cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors to check out what we're talking about. So first, we're going to kind of go through some of these overall project designs. I'm not an engineer, so you're going to have to tell me what we're looking at for some of it. But let's start at the very end of this corridor at the intersection of Jerome and Buttles. So there's going to be, my understanding, some visible improvements that are going to be made to traffic flow here. So tell me what all these markings mean and kind of what we're looking at in terms of improvements.
Well, what we see here, and so far we've gotten to base plans, which is a very preliminary geometric design. So the things like pavement markings and signing isn't figured out yet. But what we see is in the black lines is the proposed curb line, and then the colored lines, a lot of your utilities, and some right-of-way lines as well. Blue is water main, some of the green is sewer, and you have sanitary sewer shown, and some of the communications lines. So the project, basically it's starting just north of Main Street. And I should mention that all the signals will be modernized as part of this project, which will include the signal at Main Street and Jerome.
So when you say modernized, what does that mean?
That's a new signal, new equipment, new standards. They have, the signal heads themselves have back plates on them to block, from sun, when you're looking at the sun's behind a signal, it's hard to see. Okay. Things like that, new push buttons, all current standard American with Disability Act.
Sure.
Sidewalk ramps, things like that.
Perfect.
And then we start where the joint where the bridge project ended, the pavement joint. We head on from there, and this is a full reconstruction. And I should mention that this whole corridor needs to be reconstructed. That's the primary part of the project. It's
Sure.
it's a massive reconstruction. It's gets to a point where repairing and patching is more costly than what it's worth, and then it comes time to completely rebuild it. This section here on Jerome is, we won't see a whole lot of geometric changes at this particular, along this stretch, with the exception of course, when you turning a right turn from Jerome onto Buttles, you'll be going into 2 lanes as opposed to 3 now. And there is where we'll be able to make a nice wide radius for trucks. I do like that a lot better. Right now you have 2 lanes turning into 3, and sometimes, depending on how well you can see the pavement stripe, identifying what lane you're supposed to turn into, I do see people crisscrossing. So now it'll be nice to define 2 lanes into 2. Yep. And I think there were, I recall during the temporary coned off portion, there were some issues with large trucks going through there, knocking over some of the cones, and a lot of people worked up about that. But that was cones, so sure. that I think during that even they were able to pull that back and test out how that works, and all that type of stuff that's modeled through auto turn software typically, where you model the actual, the MDOT design vehicle's massive. It's a WB67, which is a wheelbase of 67 feet. So large semis, that'll be that. So that turning radius there will be much better. And then we continue on up to Indian, obviously, where Indian will connect into, several years back where there was the reconstruction project that continued up north on Eastman, towards, went up towards Saginaw, I think. So.
Okay. So there will be some improvements here. I know we had heard a lot throughout the road trial that there were some concerns about turn radius, particularly for larger trucks. So it sounds like, at least in these preliminary designs, a lot of that has kind of been taken into consideration. So that should be a lot smoother transition for people using that corridor and actually getting on to Buttles from M20. So if we move on to the next segment of this corridor, this is going to be looking at Buttles from Fitzhugh up to Cronkite. Let's take a look at what we are seeing here that will be different versus maybe what people saw during the trial where it was just a 2-lane corridor.
Yes, here and first things, I want to jump back to the turning movements again before I dig into it, is to mention that all turning, because this did come up at the open house, all the turning movements turning off of Buttles will be much better. I mean, basically, because the concern was, it'd be tighter, but it's actually not. 'Cause right now, you have a real tight radius. Essentially, you're moving out that extra lane. That's another 12 foot. So your turning radius is increased by 12 foot.
I see. So right now with 3 lanes, you're very narrow, even if you're turning left or right, because you don't have that approach. Whereas with this, you will have more of a turn approach. It's a little more natural. Yeah.
And a way to think about it, so you got a large semi coming, just did a delivery downtown. They're coming up to turn right onto Buttles. A lot of times they probably have to swing into the middle lane anyways to get their trailer to prevent it from going over the curbs and the sidewalk ramps. Now, essentially, you'll be turning into that middle lane by default. Okay. And of course, so the popular topic on this one here is on Buttles, the lane reduction for the majority of it from Jerome to State Street, to where you'll go from 3 lanes down to 2. And then you can see here in the image, there's turn lanes opened up going into Ashman for right turns on Ashman. That's also extended back to where the entrance is into the county building. That was more due to just how the geometry worked out. You don't want to have that driveway within a taper, into the turn lane. Yep. And then another turn lane at Cronkite.
Yep, those are both popular intersections, as I'm sure we saw throughout the volume study that we did. Both really good access points for downtown, and then getting over the Poseyville Road Bridge as well.
And another thing too, that this might be more my own thing, not official, but I'd throw that disclaimer out there. But what I like about this is now what it does is, you think you're heading eastbound into the downtown area, it's 2 lanes coming in, and then the 3rd lane there is the right turn going down Jerome towards the bridge. What you see now is that a lot of people will come through there, and then everyone that's going downtown all hops over into that 3rd lane at the same time, and that's where you get a lot of, if the person in front of you, say they happen to be turning at the county building, you're looking to turn into McDonald or wherever the next, that's when you could get some of those rear ends or people, or someone slowing down in front of you, or you try to some weaving. Mm-hmm. This wasn't the intent of doing this, but it's something, as I drive it, it's like, I think that'll work a lot nicer, because then everyone will be in their lane, and when you're ready to turn, then you can, at least the busy intersections, you'll be able to hop over into the turn lane, completely separate yourself out from the through traffic.
Yes, I know that was something that people were very concerned about during the trial, as well as that slower moving traffic that's trying to get off the corridor, getting into downtown or going the other direction. People were concerned about accidents as a result of that. So I think that that's going to be a great, like you said, a great opportunity for people to kind of get over and for through traffic to continue on down the corridor. So when we're looking at these designs, people will notice that we're looking at both Buttles and Indian in all of these designs. Is there going to be some changes seen to Indian in this corridor at the same time?
For this project, no. The geometry along Indian will stay the same. The thought there being that the way it's operating now, there was a higher volume of left turning, the we'll call it westbound left turns coming into downtown. Mm-hmm. Everyone come. So the thought was that with that many people doing that, we go down to the 2 lanes. It might effectively function as almost a 1-lane road if everyone's going to turn left down there. Now, saying that, there's other similarities though on the Buttles. So I think for this one, you never know in the future, I guess, is what I'm sure. Getting at. But yeah, for this particular project, that'll remain the 3 lanes throughout from the beginning of the project to the end.
Sure. So while we're on this particular segment of the corridor, I know one of the things that we've been talking about at the city is the conversion of Ashman and Rod from 1-way to 2-way streets, which they originally functioned as 2-way streets and then went to 1-way. We're now reconsidering, is that the most effective traffic flow within the city? We haven't made a decision on that just yet, but from the perspective of MDOT, how does, let's say if they were to go to 2-way traffic, how does that change any of the preliminary design that we're looking at right now?
Not a huge impact. The main thing would be our signals, the signal design we're doing at Ashman and Rod. I do think that's a very exciting project, and you're absolutely correct when you look at, I think back in the day it was intended for shift work, everyone in downtown, yep. Everyone out at the same time. Now you drive it and you have 3 lanes on Ashman Rod. Just wondering, or I guess maybe not everyone, but people like me, that's what you do.
Transportation people.
You're thinking of traffic volumes and you're like, wow, right. 3 lanes, that's excessive, So
yep.
it's good to look at the other options, get more multimodal focus. It's exciting because, to me, you got to balance everything in my role, obviously,
right.
But I do like to focus when I can on, multimodal pedestrian and bicycle facilities and non-motorized traffic. So I understand that's what the city's looking into now, not just 1 or 2, but maybe 3 or 4 different options on how you can reconfigure those corridors. A lot goes into it. Got to take traffic counts and look at turning movements and, all the signals and the geometrics up, especially when you get further into center city there. So from our perspective, though, we're early on in design, so the timing's good, and the city's looking at it. Once a determination's been made on that configuration, we'll then be able to lay out our intersections at Ashman and Rod and design those signals as the main one accordingly, because those will have to be, or possibly would have to be a 2-way.
Sure. Yeah, so if you want to learn more kind of about the background of the Ashman and Rod conversion, you can go back to Season 2, Episode 1 of this podcast. Grant Marshall and I discussed that pretty heavily. And we also talked last season, John mentioned about multimodal transportation being a focus of MDOT and the city as well. We talked about context-sensitive solutions and the Complete Streets policy, both that MDOT and the city have, back at the end of Season 1. So check out those episodes if you want a little bit of background about what we're talking about here. So the next couple of sections that we're going to talk about actually extend outside of what we would consider like the lane reduction or the Buttles corridor improvement project, but they're still part of this overall corridor and the experience that motorists and non-motorized users have as they go through this corridor. So the first is Indian and Buttles, which become Patrick and Lyon, starting from George Street up to Loons Road, kind of in front of Dow Diamond. John, can you tell us a little bit about what we're looking at in this area and if there will be any changes that motorists will see?
Yep, we still have on eastbound at Buttles there, you still have a portion of the lane reduction up into State Street. Mm-hmm. Once you get beyond State Street, that's where it opens back up into the 3 lanes. Really there, the 3rd lane flows nicely into that the access roadway there that goes into the Loons parking lot.
Yeah, that looks like it's going to be a nice gradual transition out there. Is that correct? Okay.
Yep. And then that from that point on Buttles, the geometrics go back to the 3 lanes. It's relatively unchanged. I can get into some detail on some of the further slides on some of the geometrics of the curves, but and then on Indian, same thing where it's the geometry is staying unchanged. That's the 3 lanes. We're looking into a big one here is that inside curve there, the tighter one on Indian.
Yep.
That is it's a tricky one. It bothers me that it's 45 miles an hour coming in. You have an advisory speed to slow down through the curve. There's one block, 45, and then it goes to 35. And it's just, it just always bothers me. So if there's something I could do to get rid of that, point being can we mark it down to 35 prior to the curve, keep it 35, that one block of, because then what you see, and I used to drive this every day, in the morning, and people are still cranking through there around that curve.
Oh, and, yeah. Yep. I live in this area, and it is ridiculous how quickly people drive.
Yeah, and then it becomes this battle of wanting to turn left downtown sometimes, and it part of that, though, is the way some of the speed studies are done. You go out and say, state police will conduct a speed study to determine what your speed limit should be, and sometimes doesn't always work in your favor because you go out, that's a day everyone's going 5-10 miles over the speed limit. It actually hurts your case. But there's looking into ways of doing it, more context sensitive. This isn't a big change in my opinion. But, what's the point of keeping one block at a 45 mile an hour? So
sure.
And so that being said, we're designing that curve, the super elevation of it, which is you're thinking like a racetrack. Anytime you go around a curve, you want to, instead of your normal roadway has a crown where each side slopes down to the gutter pan. Mm-hmm. Well, around a curve, you want to bring it all up to the same slope.
Okay.
It's like a racetrack to keep, you're working, help you out with gravity, sure, basically, and keep you from running off the road. But we're designing that to a 35 mile an hour design. We don't want to design it at a 45 and allow people to go through there real fast. So that's even an improvement on what's there now. And some of the things that go into that, you might say, well, why not just go for it? But there's a lot that goes into this stuff, and one of the big ones would be grading. You raise up, you do more of a super elevation, you're raising up your curb line, and at the risk of sounding too technical and boring, but it's basically you'd be raising up your curb line and then you're grading back into what here is actually park properties. Mm-hmm, yep. And they're classified as it's a 4F property. There's a lot of restrictions on what you can and can't do within those properties, and obviously then you get into right-of-way as well. We're trying to stay within the roadway right-of-way. So a lot of that all goes into that decision to have a design variance on that curve. But I think it's a good decision we're making to keep that a little bit slower through there.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because that's been the whole focus of this podcast is people will drive at the speeds and in situations in which they feel most comfortable. Doesn't always matter what the speed limit is, and that definitely hurts you in speed studies because people are driving how comfortable they feel. And then that to, the credit of those studies say, well, then that's what the speed limit should be. Well, that, especially in a residential area, which you're coming into off of that curve on Indian, is maybe not best suited, like you said, for 45 miles an hour. So a lot of that is context-sensitive solutions, which, again, we talk about quite a bit on this podcast. So that's exciting to hear that there's some forethought being put into how do we prepare this corridor to function more effectively in the confines of where it's actually located, which essentially is a residential area. So the next couple of sections that we're going to look at are Patrick and Lyon from Loons to Carpenter, from Jefferson to Bayless, and from Bayless to Washington. So what are we seeing in these areas that are new, or is everything pretty much staying the same?
Through here, a majority of it's the same. It's the goal is to completely reconstruct the pavement out here. It's in pretty rough shape. There was concrete patch project done several years ago, but it's time to rebuild. But one of the main geometric changes through here would be Lyons heading eastbound, that the curve that comes up through Carpenter Street and Jefferson there. That one actually didn't meet criteria on the curb radius. It was a little bit too tight. So what we're doing there is we're flattening out that curb a little bit. We're able to stay within the right-of-way for the most part doing that. And that'll be a great improvement, because you'll notice now on Lyons you're heading that direction. It's a combination of that tight curb and then some trees out by the curb line where you actually don't really see that signal. It kind of sneaks up on you and you're going pretty fast. So that'll be a large improvement there to smooth out that curve a little bit, and then we can evaluate it's your sight distance on if we have to remove any trees so that you can see the signal coming up ahead or the intersection ahead. And then obviously any trees that are removed are replaced. One or maybe sometime two. We do 2 trees per one, depending on what the requirement is somewhere else along the corridor.
Okay, let's take a look at the next section here, which is going to be from Jefferson over to Bayless. Any improvements in this area?
This one, let's see. This one's relatively unchanged. Where of course, the signals continue. We'll continue to have all new signals, all new ADA ramps, which are your sidewalk ramps at the intersection. And other than that, I mentioned that flattening out of that curve coming in at Jefferson, and then beyond that point through here is the same 3-lane configuration.
Okay, and the last one that people are super familiar with, because it is our beloved roundabout from Bayless up to Washington Street. Any changes here?
Yes, this one, well, as far as the overall road geometrics, not a lot of change. You come in here, everything functions. We'll run the pavement up to where the pavement joints at the roundabout project stopped. You could see a Lyons that goes up onto where US 10 BR keeps heading back to the east. And then a portion on Patrick, which is actually a segment of that, is the City of Midland roadway. So we'll be working with them, as we always do, on we're thinking that's the best. That's a real bad section of pavement in there. So we'll work with the city, and we can maybe go all the way back to that pavement joint there on Patrick. One of the things we're looking at here, and then the signals at Lyons and Washington, and also one intersection south, that's James Savage Road there, where you see that little kind of a slip ramp comes off there.
Yep.
Right, and that's kind of a goofy, those. So this is where I'm going to get probably too boring, but those two that might happen multiple times here. But those two signals are interconnected with each other on the same controller. So things like that, cleaning that up, new signals. Maybe look at, do we want to separate that out? Being that one of them actually is a MDOT signal, one is a City of Midland signal. Yep. So we work together, but sometimes that gets messy when it's the jurisdictions combined on those. And then a real big one in here that you're not seeing anything in the plans yet. It's too preliminary here, but there has been a concern by some of the local bicyclist groups where the pathway that's in the median there
Yes, the Grand Curves Trail is what we typically call it, or Grand Curves. Yeah.
Yes, where it comes down there at the Lyons and Washington intersection. You cross Lyons south in that corner, that southwest corner of Lyons and Washington. There's just a little tiny, sidewalk ramp there, and I don't think it's even ADA compliant to where you have to be, max 2% landing, and there's just this little corner, and then you cross over to the east side of Washington right there. Then the path continues on along down James Savage. Well, the issue is if you have a large group of bicyclists, or honestly even one, I got to tell you, if you look on Google Street View at that particular corner, it's the most perfect example you could ever see of. There's a woman there on a bike by herself. She's not even in the ramp because it's so small. It's hard to even get a bike on there. She's out in the lane, in the pavement in front of the curb, and there's a tree, the tree on the corner, and branches hanging down, and you can see a car coming that way, and you just think, is that car going to turn right?
Right.
Is this Google Street View about to see a crash happen? But so couldn't be a better example. So what we're looking at there's a bunch of different options on how we can reconfigure that crossing. Somehow we're going to come up with a way to provide. It might end up just being of a large chunk of extra pavement on the southwest corner there, so that a bunch of bikes can queue up there.
Okay.
Whether they still cross at that same spot, or we're able to pull it further south and cross more at James Savage. But that'll be a very welcome improvement, I think, to people in the bicyclist community.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because one of the things that we had talked about in addition to, non-motorized transportation is just pedestrian crossings in this corridor earlier this season. And the city had provided some suggestions to MDOT, both on Indian and Buttles, for maybe some enhanced or improved pedestrian crossing locations. As we looked at these plans earlier, what do those look like? Do we know where those locations are going to be just yet? And what type of considerations goes into improving a pedestrian location?
So what has already been done? The first thing would be to take. So nowadays, I should say, not always this way. You could plop things in somewhat where you wanted, but we do have to adhere by set criteria. We don't want to. MDOT doesn't want to probably get accused of being the boring ones or the no fun zone here, but it's
no, that's totally us every single time.
okay. But it's true. There's a lot of liability online and on the line, and sometimes you do one thing, and it's easy to say, oh, well, we need to do this here. Well, you got to think from our perspective, the ones doing it and responsible. You get your professional engineering license on the line, and you got to make sure the one thing you do doesn't somehow create an unsafe condition somewhere else.
Sure. Which
is most often is the case. You're kind of balancing 20 different things at once. But that being said, I'll go through. I guess we can go back to that first slide we had. That's on Jerome Street.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. And so what has been done though is the city had provided a lot of locations where these crossings at non-signal, all the crossings that are currently out there will remain.
Sure,
I guess I'll
for
start
signalized
with that.
locations.
Yeah, for signalized, and there's several that aren't at signalized. We're going to maintain those. They're already there.
Okay.
We're not going to get rid of them. And then, so what we had done is went out and did pedestrian counts. Mm-hmm. And this was last year. It would have been the best day to do it. It was during, it would be what we have at the end of this week. It's, I think, River Days.
Balloon, yeah.
Yep. River Days, Balloon Fest. On a Saturday, it was the farmer's market and a Loons game. So,
everything going on all in one small area.
Yeah. So if you get the pedestrians, it's going to be that day. Even on that day, it was only one additional crossing warranted. It's the numbers are getting too much detail here, but it's something that's 20 pedestrians within an hour, and then I think it goes down a little bit lower, 18 per hour for 2 hours, and then for 3 hours and so on. The one crossing that will be added that's not there will be at Fitzhugh. But I do want, while we're on this slide here, I want to talk about that. we'll be modifying the crossing that goes, I guess we could call it the subway crossing, the Midland City County building, the subway.
Very popular crossing for our employees to go across to the subway, yes.
Definitely.
And by subway, we mean the restaurant, not the transportation method.
Yes, yep. And what we're looking at doing there, though, is keeping that crossing, but shifting it further south. And I apologize if I'm saying south and west at the everything's at an angle on this project.
We're not on a perfect grid here.
Yeah. So I'll call it south, but it's basically on the opposite side of, really, that lines up with it. That's Ellsworth Street there.
Mm-hmm, yep.
It's obviously not Ellsworth going through the building, but it on the opposite side where the park and ride is there. And the reason for doing that is you look that there's a whole extra lane there with that right turn lane.
Yeah.
So if we can shift that on the other side of that intersection, it reduces an entire lane width of crossing distance, which that's your big one for pedestrians. There's a lot of traffic through there, and the less amount of lanes you have to cross, it's going to be better. People can get across quicker. So we are looking at improving that one from that perspective. And then I think jumping to the next slide will be good. I can explain. Yep, there on Fitzhugh on the left side of the screen. Fitzhugh at Buttles, that one met the warrants. And that was after the townhomes there were built.
Mm-hmm,
so
yeah.
I believe that would have been one of the driving factors there on a lot of people coming on Fitzhugh going to downtown that day. So we'll be adding a crosswalk at Fitzhugh. And then from that point on that we match at, here it's all signalized intersections, have the crosswalks. Could flip one more slide. Here on Buttles, we'll maintain that there's several that are at non-signalized locations. I'm not sure I'm going to get all of them correct at the moment. I think you got them you have one at State.
Yep, there is one at State. That's correct.
And then Mill or Haley, it might be Mill. And then there's one there just south of Loons Drive. Those will all be maintained. And unupgraded with, what do we call them? Like the piano key style markings. So the high emphasis markings and new signage, advanced signage, pedestrian crossing ahead. And none of the other locations met the warrants. So, but I know at our open house, there was several people brought up at Indian and State Street.
Mm-hmm, yep.
So that's a popular one. So that's not counting anything out at this point. We're early on. I just can't come on here and make guarantees.
Sure.
I do have to adhere to warrants and criteria, but sometimes there's, maybe I don't know, if you look at different things on. I haven't had myself time yet to dig into the details on the counts, or maybe some at a block up ahead. Do you count some of those crossings? Are you able to merge them together at an intersection and warrant something like that? So we'll do what we can.
Yeah. And I think you kind of brought this up already, but, as we see this corridor actually come to fruition, which isn't going to be ultimately for another 3-ish years, once we start seeing increased development in this area, once we see increased expansion of downtown, which we're anticipating, and this corridor gets done, we could see in another couple of years that the pedestrian counts increase, or that there's increased non-motorized use, and there may be warrant in the future for something like that. So it's important for people to keep in mind that road design today is not what it was 60 years ago, where you did something and you just left it alone. It kind of grows and changes with time. So this is going to be a pretty exciting project, and that we're going to have an opportunity to kind of see how this works. So anyway, that's a lot of information we've already covered. So we're going to take a quick break, and we will be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Season 2, Episode 5 of Word on the Streets. I'm here with our special guest, MDOT Projects and Contracts Engineer John Kelley. As a reminder, you can find all the designs and visual components we're talking about for today's episode online at cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors. So in our last segment, we talked pretty extensively about all the physical changes that corridor users are going to see in this project. But like I said earlier, I am not an engineer, and I'm guessing most of our listeners probably aren't either. So I think we're going to take a look at some more visual examples that people like me in communications can appreciate. So these were designs that were also provided by MDOT at the July 20th public meeting. So John, let's take a look at some roadway perspectives here. Show us what we're looking at.
So here we'll consider this direction eastbound traffic heading down Buttles Street. This is just some of the three-dimensional views of the roadway. That section AA, you see up on the top left corner is where your cross section or your vantage point is, and then looking in the direction of the arrows there. The first one's a view from George Street to State Street.
Looks like a lot of nice green space. It looks like the corridor road footprint, if you will, is kind of centered within its existing footprint. Is that accurate, or is it going to be more staying on one curb line versus the other?
It actually is. We'd be holding the left side curb line.
Okay.
Is basically staying where it's at now, and then essentially the outermost right lane is the one that's being repurposed into green space and or a non-motorized facility, as we'll kind of touch on here in a couple slides.
Okay. So the next one looks like it's from Mill to Haley Street on Buttles.
Yep, this here is where you see the Dow Diamond coming. This is once we're opening back up to 3 lanes there. So that's and then you continue on to the east, and it's basically showing the not too much exciting there after that point. It's the same geometrics.
Okay, and we've also got some views from Indian Street. I know we talked a little bit about in the last segment, there's not going to be a ton of geometric changes to this corridor, but you can kind of see just how the non-motorized trail continues to interact with the roadway through there. Tell us if we're seeing anything different in these different cross sections.
The first one there, the section AA cross sections right there at Washington, looking towards Lascaux is in there, but so that's same 3 lanes. It opens up and you have those right turn lanes into the parking lot there. And then you head on down, heading west this way, the opposite direction down Indian, or sorry, I should say, what was it?
Patrick before it gets to Indian.
Yeah, sorry, I kept wanting to say Lions. Yeah, it says Indian here, but it starts at, where Patrick here is on the first couple sections. And that's where that remains 3 lanes. Then you get into section CC, we're now on Indian. And it continues on to just a 3-dimensional view of essentially what's out there now.
Okay. So one of the things that we saw when we attended the July 20th meeting is that there are some potential options that we have as well for non-motorized improvements just within the Buttles Street corridor. We've got a couple of options here that I know MDOT is considering. Let's take a look at those 3 different options and kind of walk us through what each of those options looks like and maybe what considerations MDOT will be using to kind of determine what our best opportunity is for this corridor.
Yeah, so here's a view of what would be base plan. This would be something how MDOT would do it if there was no initiative to install a non-motorized, or if the local community didn't have any interest in doing that, which basically repair your sidewalks as needed, but maintaining their width now, typically a 5 to 6 foot wide standard sidewalk width. The first one there is a view from Ashman looking toward Rod, so you're looking more easterly, and then you flip that view around, Rod to Ashman. So one of the things we're looking at, we want to focus on here is the on the southern side of the roadway. We'll look at the first picture there, Ashman to Rod. So it'd be on your right side of the roadway was where that lane reduction's being incorporated. Mm-hmm. So this here's your base plan.
Yep. So really what we're looking at here is sidewalks staying in the same location, same width as they currently are, just adding some green space and kind of like a curb bump out, if you will, almost along that area where the third lane currently exists. So other than it being 2 lanes, looks pretty similar to what it does now.
Yep.
So let's take a look at the next one. I know there's some expanded opportunity for non-motorized transportation through here. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, now here we get into some of the more exciting things we can do. This is where now there's these large transmission poles through the consumers' poles along the south side of the roadway here, and not just consumers. There's a plethora of other utilities that share the poles with them.
Right.
And I'll mention that now is that's currently in the works, is to come up with a preliminary cost estimate. We're actually looking at what it would cost to put those overhead utilities underground, which is no small feat. So we work with consumers who are great, and they're working on an estimate for us right now to see what that would cost. It's similar to that was done on State Street in front of Dow Diamond.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it's out from people remember that, but that was done through there, and that's where that path goes along there, and that was why that was done. So this one here, though, we don't know if we could do that, because then it'll become, you get your cost estimate, you get your price on that, price tag, and then we got to evaluate funding options for that.
Sure.
That type of work is something that, out of MDOT's budget, we can't go and do that. So we're looking with the city or other ways of funding that. At that time, we can evaluate that. And that's just not, like I said, we're not being the boring ones. It's a lot of things I remember what we do applies statewide. Mm-hmm. And also federal funds are also involved. There's more restrictions on what you can do with that. And but you can't do something somewhere and pay for it, then every community across the state's going to say, "Oh, we want you." So
Sure.
That's why we had to stick to certain things out of the MDOT budget, and then work with local municipalities, and then they can do some of these enhancements, which get into this, even this increasing the width of the sidewalk here. And this is one without moving the poles. We can do that. I think this one's an 8-foot shown. You can see there where this is at, on the left side, this is at Ashman. That's Everett Carpet there, that building.
Yep.
And that you see a nice wider path where it can function as more of a non-motorized pathway.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the funding as well. I mean, this is a base $33.5 million project. Is that correct?
Correct.
So anything additional beyond the scope of what we're kind of talking about now, like moving the utilities and maybe doing some additional enhancements, that would be funding on top of that $33.5 million that would not be part of MDOT's portion, if you will. Is that
Correct.
Fair to say? Okay.
Yep, correct. And that's why I tried to explain that. Why, though? Because
right.
sometimes you're like, well, why?
Yeah.
Why not? And like, well, that would be great, to be honest. I'd love to. But I don't have that type of authority to be able to do that. And it makes sense when you're like a statewide.
Sure.
You think you'd have to do that everywhere, basically. So
right.
That's why you got to make that criteria and draw the line on what we consider a base that would be included in the roadway reconstruction.
So what we're looking at here is we're looking at an expanded, larger sidewalk on what would be the downtown side, essentially, of Buttles. Looks like an existing sidewalk width on the other side to what we have now, but some additional green space, a lot more room for pedestrian movement. But like John mentioned, there are those nice utility poles in there. So there is one option, if we go on to this next design, that we can see what it would look like with the utility poles removed. Looks like a lot more green space, looks like a different layout of where the sidewalk would be and a lot more trees. John, tell us what we're looking at here.
This with, utility poles now underground here. Obviously, that's the ideal from a design and what you can do on the roadside standpoint. This is ideal. And here we can now go to a 10-foot wide non-motorized path, which is good. That classifies as an official non-motorized pathway. That matches the width as what you see through the median on, I forgot what you call it.
The Grand Curves Trail.
The Grand Curves Trail. Yeah, I got to remember that one. But and essentially that's what the intent here is an extension of the Grand Curves Trail where it comes up, it crosses at State Street. Right now, if you want to go into downtown, you can cross there. Or if you want to continue on the rail trail, you go down by the river, and then you go underneath the bridge that way. The intent here is something the city would like to see, and I me too, as a resident, would be having that non-motorized trail kind of come in through basically right into the heart of downtown, feed that. Maybe someday, this isn't all part of this project, but someday even find a way to get it back through down Jerome, back to Main Street, and connect back in at the old historical red bridge by Curry. So what this does, without those utility poles there, now you see that sidewalk's now pushed back up towards the right-of-way line as to where the poles were. The last option was you kind of had to weave around them and bring it closer to the curb line. So here, push it back to the right-of-way line. You can plant trees within the green space there. Another thing that we're looking at there, if we're able to do this, it opens up a lot of options for green stormwater infrastructure, which is something that's always, as attention to environmental aspects grows on all these projects. We have certain criteria on channel protection and sedimentation control. And a lot of the things that, a lot of times in an urban corridor, you end up having to do a maximum extent practical form where basically you can't do everything you'd like to because it's an urban corridor. There's curbs, there's right-of-way pavement, buildings. There's not much more you can do besides an enclosed storm sewer system. But with this option now, it's a lot of stuff I like to incorporate in jobs when you can is that green. When I say green stormwater infrastructure, you're talking things like rain gardens, which you have down on Main Street as part of that streetscape, and then bioswales where it's more of a natural infiltration treatment of water over a vegetated area, can grow plants, and then by the time you run your stormwater through the bioswale itself, it filters through some sand and it ends up going into a real small underdrain, so the amount of water you're putting into the storm sewer system is much less.
Sure.
And it's treated. You're not going to have a lot of sediment and hardly anything at that point.
Right.
So that's something too within that space. Once we know we have a direction on if we can or cannot move those poles, then we'll really dig into that part of the design.
Sure. I know one thing I really like about this design especially is you can see with the addition of green space and moving that sidewalk and that non-motorized path back out away from the corridor a little bit, you're getting that nice buffer between cars and non-motorized use, which not only does that add to the safety element for people that are walking, biking, using non-motorized in that corridor, but it just looks so nice. Like aesthetically, this is just an amazing thing to look at. So pretty exciting stuff.
Definitely. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No.
I'm glad you mentioned that because when I look at the bike, I ride bike. I'm not a enthusiast, but I do ride my bike often. And one of the things that I always have in mind is like I'm the guy who'll end up with the bike trailer with little kids in the back of it. And so that's when I'm looking at, it's say a shared lane versus shared lane on the roadway. I would never, I don't think I'd pull my kids in a trailer on that. That's why I agree with you. I love designs like this, that physical separation. I'm comfortable with attaching the kids in the trailer and heading downtown.
Yep. And increased interconnectivity is a goal that we've had from the beginning of this project. So to kind of see it in fruition and say, this has been thought about how we connect Grand Curves with the rail trail. That's really the goal of a lot of this project is to improve non-motorized transportation through here, increase that interconnectivity all the way up to Center City to downtown. So really exciting to kind of see some of that thought process get put into these designs and see it start to come to fruition. Now, we get a lot of feedback on this project at the city, and we are happy to pass all that on to MDOT. But for this portion of the project, I know it's super important that you guys hear public input directly through this design process. So there is a link on the podcast website, cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors, where you can submit your feedback on the designs directly after you've reviewed them to MDOT. And we do recommend reviewing these designs first because they are pretty exciting. And that way you can, kind of know what you're looking at. So now that we've kind of gone over all the, what I would say, cool stuff, let's talk about timeline for this project. So we are in season 2 now. We still have a couple more years of this to go until we expect construction. What are we looking at in terms of timeline, and what other milestones along the way can we kind of look forward to with this?
Well, we had our first public information stakeholder meeting on July 20th. Our next step will be, it's called preliminary plans, which you might think this is what we're looking at now.
This is like pre-preliminary.
Yeah, base plans, but preliminary plans sound preliminary, but really that's on a lot more detail. We'll go into that.
Okay.
And that's on early 23, January, February timeframe there. That's where we'll have much more of the three-dimensional geometrics. You start, getting into your actual 3D model and looking at your curves and tying in grades. By then, we'll know if we can put the utilities underground.
Okay.
We'll probably have an idea on the Ashman rod configuration. Then that point, then you start getting some of your pavement markings drawn up and some of your signage planned. And then, so at that point, then we'll have a lot more definitive of a design. Still, obviously, things change beyond that. And then we'll follow up with the second stakeholder and public information meeting in spring of next year. And then we'll go into final plans will be prepared early 24. And then this is 2025 construction. Okay. So we got some time. It's nice to be. And I mentioned earlier, it's coming on relatively new to MDOT. This is nice coming into one towards the beginning. It's not playing as much catch up on this one.
Yes, like we've said numerous times on this podcast, seems like a long, drawn out, not a whole lot going on, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes that you guys are doing, a lot of design work. Like we've kind of talked about today, a lot of considerations being made in this corridor. This is a very highly used corridor, so really taking the time to do it right and incorporating a lot of what we've heard throughout even the road trial, like for example locations of turn lanes, the turn radius being reduced at Jerome and Buttles. Those are things that we heard throughout the study, throughout the public meetings that we had. That's all feedback that was utilized, whether the person saying it was technically against this project coming to fruition or not. Those pieces of feedback were still utilized in creating this design. So as you look through these designs, make sure you take a look at some of those things that you may have shared throughout that road trial, as well as throughout the different public information meetings, because you might see some of the stuff that you shared actually coming to life in some of these road designs. So the last piece is construction, which is no one's favorite. I think I speak for everyone when we all say that this is everyone's least favorite part of the whole thing. But as you said, we're still several years away from seeing this project actually start to come to life. But let's talk about right now what the plans look like for how MDOT is going to maintain traffic control during construction, because I know that is a big concern that a lot of people have in this project. Yes, these projects are exciting, but fortunately, you have to build them. So that's, even my mom now will agree with me, like, oh, that's a good point. You do have to build the road to
improve
some pain.
it.
Yep.
So, but essentially 3 options were analyzed. I'll run through those real quick. First one was to possibly, I should say the first one of them, first one counted out basically, was to possibly shift all the traffic onto one direction. That one, that was expensive, because then you have to reconfigure all the signals that are for one way to handle two-way traffic.
Okay.
And it takes longer to do it that way. That one's for ease of construction, yes, because then you can completely shut down the whole segment of Buttles or Indian, or Patrick or Lyon, and then the contractor can just crank on through. Yep. But that would take long to set that up. That would push it into 2 years of construction. So between cost and that one was factored out early on.
Okay.
Another one was a detour, which also for ease of construction, great. You shut down the road, contractor can crank away. But the most viable option would have been Saginaw Road, and obviously anyone that's local, and we could imagine US 10BR traffic onto Saginaw Road. That was modeled. That would be going to Saginaw down to Eastman and tying back in. That was modeled essentially just a failure of, backups that never cleared. It just kept going and going and going and going. So that we couldn't do that one. And which at that point you get kind of nervous because you don't always know how a partial closure of a roadway will function. And we were happy to learn when we modeled traffic numbers that we can maintain traffic on one lane in each direction through construction. So that was it was good to hear that it was something. The number being about a 5-minute delay would have been the max delay with going down to one lane, which isn't too bad. And that didn't even factor in diversion rates, which means, people that are local, where you're going, you're going to
take an alternate.
You're going to figure out a different route. Yeah.
Sure. That would be mostly through traffic is what we would kind of call it, right? People going directly through the corridor, choosing to stay on there. And when you think about delays of 5 minutes, when we did the road study and put it to 2 lanes, I mean, I think we never saw a single delay throughout that entire study. So, yes, there will be traffic delays. Yes, it will be frustrating at some point in time. But when we reopen it up to 2 lanes, we've already done the study to know that it won't hopefully inhibit traffic at all. So that is exciting stuff. So I'm not going to have you explain this in too much detail because I'll be honest, I have no idea what I'm looking at, and this just all looks great. So what we're really looking at here, though, is a cross-section of what traffic would look like during construction. Can you just kind of talk about really quickly in these different segments kind of what we would be looking at?
Yep, it's nothing overly exciting on this one. It's basically showing our maintenance of traffic cross-sections that would be down to one lane in each direction. You see on stage 1 on Jerome, it's not a one-way pair. So you'd shift it all over to one side of the road and have 2 lanes there, construct the other half of the roadway. And then stage 2, we're showing construct the middle portion of the roadway, and then you'd have each lane on each, the left and right sides of Jerome. Stage 3, then you would finish off the remainder.
Gotcha.
On Indian and Buttles and Patrick Lyon, it's a bit different, obviously, to where we would construct, majority of the roadway, keep one lane open each direction, and then you swap that. But so, long story short, just showing them maintaining one lane of traffic in each direction throughout.
What's the timeline from switching from stage 1 to stage 2, especially 1, 2, and 3 for Jerome? Do you know roughly how long that typically takes between each?
Could go to the next slide touches on that. And I don't, as far as exact times, I don't know right now. There's a lot goes into it. But we show this phase 1, the project itself would be within 1 year, which is nice. I didn't mention that with the single lane closure, we could do this in 1 year construction season, which I don't think people want to be affected 2 years in a row, especially local businesses. And that's another one I didn't touch on too, kind of backtracking here, but the single lane open is much better for your local businesses and commerce downtown. You still have people going through there, can get down there, as opposed to a full closure. Where,
yes, that's correct.
That'd be more of an impact on businesses. But within a construction season, whatever the exact time frame is, I don't have that yet. We'll figure that out when some of the details. One of the things that really next on the to-do list is coming up with the scope we're adding in to replace the city water main.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which predominantly goes along, that's down the north side of Buttles Street. And so obviously once you're in there tearing up the roadway, you want to, if you have an old water main or anything, we look at all that stuff and try to get as much you can improved while we're there, while you have the maintenance of traffic in place. So but that takes time, so that'll impact how long that duration needs to be. But this phasing's nice, where it keeps that blue phase 2. It's the majority where that water main's to be done. I should also mention that there's a lot of water main crossings that cross the roadway. So we might see some intermittent full closures, to be determined. Got, that maintenance of traffic, got a lot of details to work out on that still. We have consultants. I was on board designing that. But those might be, but it's things, options there are night work. There's very little traffic out there, just a detour around, a real localized detour just to get around that one spot, and it'd be like a one night type of thing to do that.
Sure.
Maybe. So that's what we're seeing here. We'd start with the easternmost half of the project, phase 1, the beginning of the year, get that done, open it back up, and then phase 2 will be the more downtown portion. And let's see, what other notes do we have on here? Apologize, I'm up to speed on everything that's on here, but it doesn't touch on, well, yeah, we do, okay. Yeah, pedestrian and driveway access will be provided throughout the construction duration. So that's something I mentioned, especially with that path, the grand curve path.
Yep.
Got it.
Remembered.
Yes, some of that, a lot of those ramps at the intersection, that's important to note that just due to the construction I talked about earlier, raising curb lines, we'll have to tear a lot of those out, rebuild them. It's a good opportunity to make them more ADA compliant now. But so there will be intermittent detours even on the bicycle facility there. It won't be closed. We can't just close it. So we'll have a reasonable detour path through maybe some of the local streets for bicyclists as we do that.
Awesome. Well, we've talked about a lot on this project today. John, thank you so much for joining us and kind of going through everything that was talked about at the July 20th meeting and kind of what our next steps are in this project. Just to revisit that real quick, MDOT is compiling all the feedback that they are getting on these designs right now, kind of going back in, taking a look at some things, and we look forward to seeing maybe some more next phase of preliminary design work in early 2023. So, as we mentioned earlier, our listeners can find all of these design documents, all this information that we talked about in regards to timeline, traffic control, ways that you can submit your own public feedback after you've reviewed everything to MDOT on our podcast website, cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors. That's all for this installment, but we will be back soon with another episode and more updates on the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project and other infrastructure projects in our community. See you soon, and slow down. This has been Word on the Streets, a podcast created by the City of Midland, Michigan, and produced by the MCTV Network. For more information on this podcast or to learn more about the Buttles and Indian Corridor Improvement Project, visit cityofmidlandmi.gov/corridors.